Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. This is mostly going to be, at first, I'm just going to present my overview of different personality systems. My personality system, be a very brief overview of my personality system, what I think personality systems are, what can we do to come up with better systems, and maybe what's the underlying truth. I think that's what's important to me with anything, is just getting as close to the truth as possible, and whether or not that's through my system or other systems. Actually seen some really cool ones and had some really good conversations with people on the server concerning personality systems. So I'm interested to have this discussion and see what people think, and we could talk more about it. I will start going through. So personality systems, basically they're conceptual frameworks to understand human behavior, why we do the things that we do, what's the purpose of some of our actions and the way that we think. And essentially that's used in a variety of things, from personal development, career guidance, team building, psychology, you name it. It goes back a long time, essentially, where people have noticed patterns in behavior. I mean, I believe it goes all the way back to ancient Greece. The purpose of it, I think, overall is just to categorize and understand people and their behavior in a more holistic way. And I think that's extremely useful in life. I originally got into personality types from two main reasons. Writing, one of the best ways that you can develop very in-depth and human-like characters is through Enneagram or MBTI, and kind of understanding the way that the character's motivations would work given the personality types. And reality TV. I remember I watched like Survivor and Big Brother when I was younger, and I remember that together the show, they had to take like personality tests. I always wondered what those were and like what the different personalities of the people on the show were. And that made me ask a lot of questions when I was a kid, and that's how I mostly found things like MBTI and Enneagram and the Big Five, was from those types of interests in people and why they do the things that they do. And it turns out I'm an ENFJ, and we are fascinated by people and why they do the things that they do. So it made sense that was one of the early ways of me getting interested in these types of concepts. So what types manifest in terms of like your behavioral patterns, whether you're an introvert and extrovert, what does that mean? People, for the most part, misunderstand a lot of these typologies because they think that, for instance, somebody who's an introvert is antisocial, and that's just not the case. A lot of introverts can be extremely charismatic and really good with people. They just get tired, and those types of definitions have shifted over the years, so it's easy for people to get confused. There's also different styles of thinking. A common misconception on things like MBTI is that your static traits that are set for life, and you're either an extrovert or a thinker or a filler, and that's it. However, these are preferences, and people can have strengths beyond their default types. So for instance, I'm a filler, but I'm also someone who's very analytical, and I've had to develop those skills, but they're not necessarily second nature to me. That's something I'm more of a have an emotional reaction as opposed to viewing everything through an analytical lens. And of the major types, there's the Big Five, which is the standard in terms of like, it's been a lot of academic research has gone into it, and it's had a lot of people who are proponents of it. Namely, the biggest one is probably like Jordan Peterson. I actually took his assessment, and it was valuable. It was actually really interesting to see those traits and kind of where I fell on those. Now, the Big Five conception is that you can work on these traits and they change over time, which I think is a more accurate way of viewing traits as opposed to things like MBTI or Enneagram, where they try to kind of have this perception of these being more static. And I think that's true, but for a reason we're going to go over more when I get into my system. I think that there's a reason why we have ideas of like static traits, and also we all can observe that over time we have changed. So the strengths and limitations of existing systems like the Big Five is it's empirically verified for the most part, but it doesn't give you a lot of, in terms of like, how is this useful to me? MBTI is very easy to understand and intuitive for people. It's how myself and a lot of people get into personality systems. but it's not as scientifically rigorous. And I think that has to do with the idea of the dichotomy approach to typology, where you're either this or that. Again, these are preferences that people have, but I think that also it doesn't give you the big picture as to why we have preferences, or why you can have a preference but go against that preference. Enneagram is really good about your core motivations, and in terms of like the actual personal growth element, is actually very good for that, although it's not easy to get into, especially if you get into tri-types. And then DISC is mostly used in like corporate settings to kind of understand how teams work together, but it has to do with communication. But here we can easily see that there's the idea of personality, and there's these different perspectives on this same image of what is the human mind and where do these things come from. And I think that that's what inspired me to make my system, is that I viewed it as similar to an idea in string theory, where there was dozens of string theories, and Edwin had the idea of, well, are these all just saying the same thing but in different ways? And I think that that's something that most people, we can all look at the same picture and our perspectives are different. And I think that the levels are a big part of that, and why people have those perspectives with the levels is because we are all coming from different places in terms of the way that we see the world. And but we can all see the same thing and just interpret it different. But there's still something there that is a commonality. So my system, the Triadic Personality System, or TPS, and somebody asked me this earlier. Yes, I did name it after Office Space. I couldn't find an acronym that didn't sound ridiculous or was like UPS, which would probably have gotten me sued anyway. So I was like, oh, all right, well, this one is at least fun and I like it. So and it has to do with the triads. So each of the domains, the way that the system works is that you have different engrams or filters for the world, or lenses that you see the world through. And these are typically traits that you've developed over time through experience. Some of them develop early, some of them later, and a lot of that has to do with like neuroscience. And these are ways that we like the world to be. In terms of like external domain, it's the world around us. Do you like things structured? Do you like things more loose, and you can make decisions? And this has to do with the outside world around us. And then some people are more ambivalent. They are more flexible with change and the way things are around them. Another way of thinking this one is live in a house and you're very structured and organized and OCD, and somebody else isn't. The way that you guys want your outside world is going to be much different. And in terms of external domain, there's also the will triad, which is how you deal with the outside world. In terms of asserting yourself. So some people are more passive, and some people are more assertive, and other people are more diplomatic in terms of like what they're willing to let the outside world be like, and how much they're gonna put themselves in a position to change it. And then the design triad has to do with how we like our morality around us. So, for instance, some people are very lawful. The rules are the rules, and that's how they see the world, and that's how the world should be. A lot of this is oughts, like the world ought to be, very normative. And then there are people who are more pragmatic. They're more practical about things, and more of a middle ground. And as you can probably tell from these are spectrums, or like a continuum of similar to like the Big Five, right? You're going to score higher or lower in one direction or the other in terms of where you fall in these traits. The middle ground would probably be pragmatic, be between someone who's more principled, as they derive the way that they see things from like their personal values, and other people derive it by rules, and those aren't always going to be the same thing. Internal domain has to do with your, in terms of your desires for where those come from. Are you more self-indulgent? What's good for me is good for me. Are you more self-mastery, which is like you control your desires for things? And then self-aware is where you're aware, but you're also still able to kind of indulge yourself on occasion. These are just have to do with like your self-control and the way that you feel about yourself, because we've moved into the internal domain. And so this is the inverse of the external domain, as you could probably guess. And so motivation, whether you get your motivation from intrinsically or from outside factors. For instance, if somebody, you need encouragement from people, and that goes back to things like love languages, right? In extrinsic motivated people are more going to be responsive to things like, like compliments and people offering them things. And then responsive is you kind of have that intrinsic motivation, but you're also very influenced by extrinsic motivation. And internal domain behavior, this is how you see the world from the inside. Are you someone who's going to feel as if things are not good? You anticipate negative outcomes? Are you a more realistic person? It goes to kind of like the more practical with the external domain. This is more of an internal, how you feel about the world, as opposed to what you want from the world. And interpersonal domain has to do with are you somebody who is more wanting to be in groups, or are you somebody who feels more comfortable being on your own? And this is different than your extroversion versus introversion in MBTI, because this is a preference in terms of like relationships, as opposed to somebody who gets their energy from being around people. You can get your energy from being around people, but also be very independent in my system. And I think that that's the kind of dichotomy that gets missed by things like MBTI, is that there are people who fall on these spectrums who would seemingly have contradictory motivations, but that makes sense for them. And that's that synthesis of these two kind of competing, kind of like a dialectical approach to personality science. I think that's a perfect way of expressing what I'm trying to do here. Communication, this goes to things like DISC, where there's different communication styles, and this has to do with your interpersonal relationships. These are your engrams, or your kind of ways of dealing, algorithms in a way, of how you deal with people. And that's what the interpersonal domain is. Direct communication, someone who's very assertive with their verbiage and how they talk to people. Someone who's more adaptive and different is mixed communication, and someone who's more passive or indirect. And then finally, interpersonal stimulation has to do with where you get your energy from with relationships, and that has more to do, static is more of an introvert, and dynamic is more of an extrovert. Modular is somebody who is not as far on either end of the spectrum. And I think that that's, again, a differentiation between this system and something like MBTI. And then processing, so this is what's interesting about this. So you have these different domains, right? You have interpersonal, you have external, and you have internal. And you're getting data from all this stuff. And if you really think about the outside world, is tons of stuff is being thrown at us on a daily basis from all sorts of things. And the way that we make sense of the world is through these filters that we have for different things. So one of them is, are you an intuitive person? And this goes back to MBTI, the difference between an intuitive and a sensor, right? Sensors tend to be more analytical, more of a thinker in terms of like the way that they think about things, and a filler would be more of an intuitive type, and that's why NFs and MBTI are often, like intuitive fillers, intuitive thinkers. But in this system, it's a little bit different. It's separated out. So analytical, they're more logical with what they value. There's people who are more varied, and then there's people who like have more of a they rely more on their subconscious in terms of like their decision making. I think that that's the difference, is the conscious versus subconscious divide. And then regulation has to do with our emotional states. Some people tend to be more in control of their emotions. Some people tend to be more turbulent with their emotions, and that's also something that's often found on MBTI. And then there's people who are more responsive, so they're going to be more responding or reactionary to different things. And that's what the regulation triad is. And then finally, reality triad is very relevant to the levels. Essentially, there's three types of levels. There's more the physical, or like you're more centered in day-to-day things, concrete things, sensory things. And then social is more of culture and the world around us. And you see this in 5, 6s, 4, 5, and 6 probably. And then 7, 8, 9 would probably be universal, which is abstract thinking and conceptualization and principles and patterns of things. What's interesting is on my test, a lot of the 9s, they end up getting social, but it's because they're universal thinkers who are also physical thinkers, and because of that they're kind of centered in the middle in my system. But I found that very interesting. They actually score really high on 1. And most of the time they're kind of balanced between the two, and in my system usually if you're balanced between two traits, you're the middle one. So that's something that I want to explore. The thing about the processing domain is this is a modular domain, so it modulates the other domains. So for instance, if you're somebody who is a universal thinker and you're an extrovert, your expression of extroversion is going to be different than somebody who's more of a physical extrovert. And that's something to keep in mind, is the processing domain changes over time. So these other traits tend to be more static. This one tends to change depending on experience and education and so on that we have in life. And we're more hard-coded on the other ones than this one. This one tends to be more flexible, but it also controls the modulation of the other domains. So you will see yourself have the same kind of inclinations, but because you've matured and you're wiser, you're going to have a different expression of those things as you get older and you change. And this is my idea of where our engrams come from in terms of our triads and why we have them. And that has to do with the way that information is filtered and flows from our collective or shared reality to our personal realities. Our personal reality is more of a subconscious storage of our engrams and the ways that we think and feel about things. And then the conscious is what we're aware of and what we actually act upon. And it tends to be more collective because we're sharing it with other people, as opposed to the personal reality is our own and people don't know about it unless we share it. And so what you see is and we've had these discussions in terms of free will versus determinism. I think that it's both. And the reason why I think it's both is because of this. I see it as like the collective reality influencing our personal reality, and those two things battling with each other is sort of what our conceptions of free will and determinism are. So that's mostly my system and my ideas of what personality types are. The reason why I came up with this system specifically was because I wanted to understand why we have personality types and explain that. I also I didn't understand why I had to take like 15 tests to find out little parts about myself, and I thought that there had to be a overarching source of these things, and if I can come up with a way that makes sense, I can kind of build on that framework, and pretty much one test can give me all of my results. And so far I've been pretty successful in terms of the results and feedback I've gotten from people.